From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
President Trump, you say, what can you do? You can stop the guns from getting into these children's hands!
While parents and children in Florida beg President Trump to do something about the nation's gun crisis, after 17 people are shot dead at a high school in Parkland, Florida, the president finally addresses the nation, but never mentions guns.
We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health.
The Florida school shooting comes a year after President Trump repealed an Obama-era regulation making it harder for people with severe mental disabilities to purchase firearms. We'll get response and look at the Florida gunman's history of threatening women and his possible extremist political beliefs. Then to South Africa.
I do believe that when one is elected in this type of position, you basically become a servant of the people of South Africa, and I'll seek to execute that task with humility, with faithfulness, and with dignity as well.
Cyril Ramaphosa has been sworn in as South Africa's new president following the resignation of Jacob Zuma. We'll go to South Africa. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. Senate has wrapped up 4 days of open debate without advancing a single measure on immigration. In 4 separate votes Thursday, senators failed to reach the 60 votes needed to move forward on a bill that would have protected 1.8 million young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers, while further militarizing the U.S.-Mexico border. The failed votes came as President Trump blasted a bipartisan bill as a total catastrophe and threatened to veto. This is Senate Minority Leader, Democrat Chuck Schumer of New York.
There's only one reason why the Senate will be unable to reach a bipartisan solution to DACA: President Trump. President Trump created this problem by terminating the DACA program last August. Since that decision, President Trump has stood in the way of every single proposal that could become law.
A measure supported by President Trump got the least number of votes, just 39 out of 100. It would have sharply curtailed U.S. immigration quotas and expanded border militarization funding by $25 billion while providing a lengthy path to citizenship for Dreamers. Unless Congress passes an immigration bill, hundreds of thousands of Dreamers could see their DACA status begin expiring as early as March 5th, although 2 federal courts have ruled the Trump administration cannot end the program. Meanwhile, DACA recipients and their supporters have launched a 250-mile, 15-day march from New York City to Washington, D.C., where they plan a mass protest ahead of DACA's March 5th expiration date. This is DACA recipient Lee Adorno speaking at the start of the march in Lower Manhattan.
I feel like my parents and people around the country who are undocumented have sacrificed so much, and like to this day they're criminalized every night in the evening news, right? And we feel like that's not fair. We're asking for dignity and respect for everyone, right? Not just the Dreamers, because right now we're getting a lot of attention. Politicians keep promising us like reforms or like fixes, but nothing ever happens, right? So this walk is not necessarily towards politicians to change their mind, but more towards the community. We see that the community responds better than
students and family members gathered for a candlelight vigil Thursday night to mourn the 17 people who were killed on Wednesday in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The massacre at the Stoneman Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida, was the 18th school shooting this year. At least 15 other people were wounded in the attack by a 19-year-old former high school student named Nicholas Cruz, who used a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle and multiple magazines. On Thursday, Lori Aldoff, the mother of 14-year-old shooting victim Alyssa Aldoff, spoke on CNN.
The gunman, a crazy person, just walks right into the school, knocks down the window of my child's door, and starts shooting her, and killing her. President Trump, you say, what can you do? You can stop the guns from getting into these children's hands.
On On Thursday, Nicholas Cruz confessed to carrying out the mass shooting. According to a police report, Cruz was a former member of Junior ROTC who was obsessed with guns, had been expelled from the high school. CNN reports that Broward Sheriff's deputies were called to the Cruz family home 39 times since 2010 for reports of domestic disturbances. Despite those calls and other warnings, Cruz was able to purchase his AR-15 semi-automatic assault rifle legally at the Sunrise Tactical Supply gun store in Coral Springs, Florida. At the White House, President Trump gave a speech Thursday in which he made no mention of guns, but instead talked about mental health.
Our administration is working closely with local authorities to investigate the shooting and learn everything we can. We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health.
President Trump's comments sparked outrage from gun safety advocates who pointed out last February President Trump repealed an Obama-era regulation that made it harder for some people with severe mental disabilities to purchase firearms. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, the NRA spent over $52 million in political advertisements in the 2016 election, with more than $11 million spent in support of Trump's campaign alone. We'll have more on the Florida shooting and the United States epidemic of gun violence after headlines. In South Africa, African National Congress leader Cyril Ramaphosa has been confirmed as the new president after the former leader, President Jacob Zuma, resigned from office abruptly Wednesday night amidst a series of corruption scandals. This is President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking today.
The issues that you have raised, issues that have to do with corruption, issues of how we can straighten out our state-owned enterprises and how we deal with state capture are issues that are on our radar screen. Those are issues that we're going to be addressing.
Cyril Ramaphosa once led the National Union of Mine Workers under apartheid in the 1980s, later became one of Africa's richest men as he built a business empire that included mining interests. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Johannesburg, South Africa, to speak with a leading South African activist about South Africa's change in leadership. Ethiopia's prime minister said Thursday he's stepping down from office after a massive wave of protests undermined his party's grip on power. The surprise resignation of Haile Mariam Desalegn came just days after Ethiopia released senior Oromo opposition leader Bekele Gerba from prison, and just weeks after Ethiopia's government said it would release political prisoners and close an infamous prison in the capital, Addis Ababa. In El Salvador, a court has released a woman who was sentenced to 30 years in prison after she gave birth to a stillborn baby. In 2008, Teodora del Carmen Vasquez was convicted of aggravated homicide after she went into labor while at work, tried unsuccessfully to summon an ambulance, and passed out on the floor of the bathroom after miscarrying. This is Teodora Vasquez speaking just after her release Thursday.
I know my effort has been worth it, and now I'm very happy to go back to my family again. I was separated from them for 10 years, 7 months, but now we're back together again. Thank you.
Representative with Amnesty International welcomed the ruling, but said at least 27 other women remain behind bars in El Salvador due to obstetric complications. Back in the United States, a federal appeals court ruled Thursday President Trump's latest ban on travelers from 6 majority Muslim countries unconstitutionally discriminates against people because of their religious beliefs. Writing for a 9-4 majority at the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Roger Gregory wrote Trump's travel ban unconstitutionally was tainted with animus toward Islam, adding, quote, on a fundamental level, the proclamation second-guesses our nation's dedication to religious freedom and tolerance. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case in April and has ruled Trump's travel ban can be fully enforced until it renders its decision. The New Yorker magazine reports Donald Trump went to great lengths to cover up extramarital affairs in the years before he became president. Journalist Ronan Farrow reports Trump used his close ties to American Media Inc., the publisher of the National Enquirer, to quash a story about a consensual sexual affair with Karen McDougal, a former Playmate of the Year. According to Farrow, the Enquirer paid McDougal $150,000 for the exclusive rights to her story, then buried the piece just before the election. The tabloid also reportedly paid McDougal to write a fitness column in an attempt to further buy her silence. In New York City, New York Police Sergeant Hugh Barry was acquitted Thursday on murder charges in the fatal shooting of African-American woman Deborah Danner in October of 2016. Danner had mental health issues, including schizophrenia. Police say she was shot and killed in her own home in the Bronx after a neighbor called 911. When police arrived, they found Danner naked in her bedroom holding a pair of scissors. Sergeant Hugh Barry fatally shot her twice in the chest, saying he feared for his life after the 66-year-old woman picked up a baseball bat. Barry has been sued twice in recent years for brutality. He was acquitted by Judge Robert Neary in a bench trial after he waived his right to a trial by a Bronx jury. Austin has become the first city in Texas and the first in the South to make paid sick leave a mandatory requirement for non-government employees. Austin City Council voted 9-2 early this morning for the measure, which will require employers to provide up to 64 hours of paid sick leave. To see full coverage of the fight for sick leave in Austin and around the country, go to our website at DemocracyNow.org. And in Texas, supporters of 23-year-old asylum seeker Laura Monterosa say she was put in solitary confinement for 60 hours at the T. Don Hutto Detention Center outside Austin in order to pressure her to recant her allegations that she was sexually assaulted by a guard. ICE says Monterosa was under, quote, medical observation, but she later made a strange call to her lawyer from an unusual phone number. Grassroots leadership shared a recording with Democracy Now!
I wanted to call you because I wanted to tell you that everything I had said was false. And I was forced to tell you that because if not, they were going to lock me again in that room. And I didn't want to be locked again in that room.
This comes as the FBI is conducting a civil rights investigation into the alleged abuse. After her call, dozens of supporters went to visit Monterosa, who tried to commit suicide in January. She fled El Salvador to escape sexual persecution as a lesbian and has been detained 8 months. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Parkland, Florida, students, parents, families gathered for a candlelight vigil Thursday night to mourn the 17 people killed at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida, in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. At least 15 other people were wounded after a 19-year-old former student named Nicholas Cruz arrived at the high school in an Uber at 2:19 in the afternoon, armed with a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle and a black duffel bag and a backpack filled with loaded magazines of ammunition. On Thursday, Cruz confessed to carrying out the mass shooting, according to a police report. Cruz was a former member of Junior ROTC, obsessed with guns, and had been expelled from the high school. On Thursday, President Trump gave a speech at the White House in which he made no mention of guns.
Our administration is working closely with local authorities to investigate the shooting and learn everything we can. We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health.
Also early Thursday morning, President Trump tweeted, "So many signs that the Florida shooter was mentally disturbed, even expelled from school for bad and erratic behavior. Neighbors and classmates knew he was a big problem. Must always report such instances to authorities again and again," he tweeted. Trump's speech and tweets sparked outrage from gun safety advocates and families of those who were killed in Parkland, who pointed out that last February, President Trump repealed an Obama-era regulation that made it harder for people with severe mental disabilities to purchase firearms. Some mental health advocates, meanwhile, warned President Trump's comments perpetuated stigma against people with mental illness. For more, we're joined by two guests. From Washington, D.C., Lindsay Nichols is with us, Federal Policy Director for Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And in Nashville, Tennessee, Jonathan Metzl, professor of psychiatry and the director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. He's the lead author of a Vanderbilt study that's entitled Mental Illness, Mass Shootings, and the Politics of American Firearms, which found that fewer than 5% of fatal shootings in the United States are committed by people diagnosed with mental illness. He writes frequently about gun violence in America, including a recent piece in Politico that's headlined, "I'm a psychiatrist. Making gun violence about mental health is a crazy idea." We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Dr. Jonathan Metzl, why is it a crazy idea?
Well, let me say, first of all, that in the aftermath of mass shootings, it's understandable to me why the question of mental illness comes up, because these shootings are so terrorizing, so spectacular, that we ask, I think, a very important question, which is, what would cause somebody to go over the edge when there are so many responsible citizens, responsible gun owners in the world? And so, in that sense, I think we do learn a lot from the mental health histories of mass shooters. But I see it at a policy level as the height of irresponsibility to do what President Trump did yesterday, which is to make the discourse really, excuse me, about mental health, because on a statistical level, people with mental illness, first of all, are far less likely than sane people to commit gun crimes. And even in the case of mass shootings, what we see is that even though we jump to this question of mental illness right away, many other factors are probably more explanatory, everything from social networks, ideologies, male gender, race, the access of firearms. And in that sense, these are very complicated policy questions. And so I feel like what President Trump is doing when he shifts the conversation just to mental health, as he said, is to cynically shut down, I think, a real conversation about what we can really do as a society to stop mass shootings and also just to stop gun crime more broadly.
Lindsay Nichols, as this has played out in Parkland, this horror, I wanted to go back to the quote of the mother who lost her 14-year-old daughter, who rocked the country yesterday as she spoke directly into the camera addressing President Trump.
President Trump, you say, what can you do? You can stop the guns from getting into these children's hands.
Lindsay Nichols, stop the guns from getting into children's hands. And it's not just her, but students are being interviewed. These are high school students, unlike Sandy Hook 5 years ago, that are able to articulate their views on guns, and over again they are saying the same thing. Lindsay Nichols, your thoughts today.
Absolutely. This is a horrible tragedy, and we're working carefully at developing policy solutions that will address it. I think the real question is about vetting people who have access to guns. And in this circumstance, we have a very young person with a history that many members of the community knew about, but there was clearly no way to get that information into the gun purchaser background check system under Florida law. There are a couple of states that actually do have systems now in place that would allow that information to get into the background check system. California, Oregon, and Washington specifically have now adopted laws that allow a family member or a law enforcement officer to seek a court order. And that court order means that the person goes into the background check system, and that if that person already has guns, those guns can be temporarily removed. So it's a temporary prohibition when a person is in crisis, and it is really based on evidence that there is some danger here, that threats of violence, threats of suicide, and that's really what the country needs right now. And I think the policymakers really need to start looking carefully at that in every state across the country and at the federal level.
I mean, there were reports that the police went to Cruz's home something like, I think CNN was saying, 39 times in the last 8 years to deal with domestic violence and a mentally ill person, Lindsay Nichols. He was still able to legally buy an AR-15 last year.
Right, absolutely, and that shows that something is horribly wrong here. We know that domestic violence abusers are at a very high risk of committing violence in the future. The federal laws have big loopholes here, big giant loopholes. Even we can say there are some laws, and that's great, but we have to figure out a way to extend those laws so they cover individuals like this. And the procedure that states are now adopting allows the person to be temporarily prohibited from possessing guns without other rights being infringed or without a full domestic violence restraining order. I mean, in many of these circumstances, the real issue is access to guns, and that is what we need as a society to address. Stalkers, in this instance, there was some evidence that this person was also guilty of stalking, are also another high-risk category, and we have to find a way to prevent access to guns, because all we really have at this time is a background check system that only usually works in 3 minutes, but it doesn't allow for a extensive evaluation of the person. If the evaluation isn't done within 3 days, 3 business days, the person gets the gun. So we have to make sure that those records are complete, and we have to find a way to include records of people like this shooter who had a long history of violent behavior.
And the last February, President Trump signing legislation. Well, President Trump, in one of his first acts in office, repealing the Obama-era rule about people mentally ill decreasing their access to guns. Explain what it was. And then I want to get Dr. Metzel's response as well.
Absolutely. So this goes all the way back to 2007 after the Virginia Tech shooting. There was a bipartisan effort, and a compromise bill was actually enacted, signed by President Bush, that it was meant to strengthen the records in the background check system. And one of the provisions there required federal agencies like the Social Security Administration to create a process to get records in to the system, and then also allow people to get their records removed if they weren't actually a danger, if they had a gun. The Social Security Administration issued a rule to implement that law a couple of years ago, and then Congress. But as soon as President Trump came into office, Congress passed and Trump signed a law revoking that rule. So those people could not be put in the background check system, and that procedure was not in place.
Okay, Dr. Metzel, can you respond to that and talk about the relationship between the National Rifle Association and the idea that it's mental health that is to blame for mass shootings?
Sure. Well, first, in response to, I think Lindsay's exactly right here, that the issue for the action that President Trump did right when he took office was to allow gun rights for probably the most severely mentally ill persons in this country. I would say that on the day-to-day level, this probably had relatively little practical impact, and I say that because these are people who are already under, they already have basically assistance living their daily lives in that way, and so most of these people probably aren't out walking around in that regard, but it did seem to have a lot of symbolic effect, and the symbolic effect was to basically say there's no regulation whatsoever on gun rights, and that pretty much anybody, even people who we've already deemed to be high risk, even those people are going to have unfettered access to guns. And so symbolically, and especially at times like this, I think that that's an important point to come back to. In relation to this question of mental illness, this has been a canard that has really been part of the NRA platform for a while, this idea that basically guns and bullets don't kill people, the mentally ill do, to quote Ann Coulter. It's been part of the NRA platform for a while, this idea that we don't need a registry of gun buyers or gun owners, we need a registry of mentally ill persons. As a psychiatrist, I can say that that's, first of all, stigmatizing, but also, I think, to my mind, it really won't do anything at all to stem the tide of of gun violence and gun death in this country, or of mass shootings. I say that for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, is that there's no psychiatric diagnosis whose symptom is shooting somebody or harming somebody, and for that reason, what we see across the board when we look at studies is that persons with mental illness, as we've just heard in the news headlines today, are, first of all, less likely than sane people to attack or shoot other people. But also, they're far more likely to be the victims of violence, and we see that with the police case that you were talking about in the news headlines, where people's symptoms are misinterpreted, and so they're much more likely, almost 50% more likely in some studies, to be the victims of violence. And the other factor, I think, that as why I think people in the mental health community are so upset about this, is that there are other factors, other predictive factors that we can look at, and we've already heard a few of them: male gender, history of domestic abuse, history of stalking, history of violence, past history of violence, social networks, factors like that. And so when we just say this is a mental health problem, what we're doing is we're closing the door on all of these broader issues, also substance use and abuse, factors like that. And so in a way, I think the take-home point of all of this is that mental health is an important piece of this puzzle, but mental health is part of a question of prevention rather than prediction. In other words, I think that the main point is, how can we as a society create safety laws, almost like we do with driver's license, to make sure that the people who are operating this machinery are safe, rather than picking a needle out of a haystack about which one person is going to go on and commit a violent act.
This is Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar speaking Thursday.
I echo what the President said this morning about the commitment this administration has to addressing the challenges of serious mental illness in America. While most Americans with mental illness are not violent, in fact, they're more likely to be victims of crimes themselves. We know that untreated serious mental illness can be associated with acts of violence like we saw yesterday. The Department of Health and Human Services will be laser focused on this issue in the days, weeks, and months to come, and it has already been a priority under our administration.
Dr. Jonathan Metzl, your response.
Complete abdication of responsibility in that regard. I think that just focusing on mental illness really decontextualizes the issue of gun violence in this country. It's a question of gun access as much as anything else. And as I was just mentioning, and I invite readers to look at, for example, my Politico article that details the research about this, there is no predictive test in a way. And so in that regard, I feel like this is nothing but reifying stigma, and also really displacing what I think are the real focus of the gun should be. And the other issue, I think, and I hope, is that I think, I'm somebody who studies gun policy. I go around the country doing focus groups and interviews. I feel like actually there is a lot of centrist movement on this. And I say this because maybe at one time, people would have said, oh, this is a pro or anti-gun debate. We're pro or anti-Second Amendment, but nobody's saying that anymore. Even gun policy researchers like myself and Lindsay aren't saying we want to take away anybody's guns. Really, the question is, how can we respect the Second Amendment and let legal gun owners, live their lives, and at the same time have policies in our society that keep everybody safe? And in a way, if you look at the victims, Republicans and Democrats are being shot and killed. Republican and Democrat children are being shot and killed. And so in a way, I feel like there's a centrist movement in our country. And when I hear stuff about just blaming people with mental illness, first of all, I don't think people are going to buy it because it's so clearly false. And second, I just think that the government is in a way going against the will of the people who want a common sense solution to this.
Finally, Lindsay Nichols, you work for the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. That's Gabby Giffords, the congresswoman from Tucson, Arizona, who was gunned down in a parking lot, a bullet to her brain, and yet, amazingly enough, she survived. Has been fighting along with her husband, the astronaut, to bring gun control to this country. What do you think are the most important acts now? Now in the media, I'm not even talking Fox, but on the other networks, they'll immediately say, well, obviously an automatic weapons ban is off the table, already accepting what the terms of the debate have been so far. But what are you demanding now? What would make people safer in this country?
Right, absolutely. We're working to strengthen the background check system, and that means focusing on things like record reporting, focusing things on like getting a process for getting people into the background check system. These are really our focuses, because we want to make sure that the proper vetting occurs, that law enforcement has the opportunity to provide input into that, into the whether a person should have access to a gun or not. I mean, that's very important. And those are the kinds of things we've been focusing on because, and we are getting some hope here. We are seeing lawmakers start to question the gun lobby, and that is happening very slowly, but it is happening. And I think we have to push because every day we know that so many more people are killed in this country in homicides and suicides. And and I'm starting to see some courage on the part of politicians. I'm starting to see them really, think through the impact of the policies they support, and I think I think there is some reason for hope here.
And this statistic put out by Everytown for gun safety, this was the 18th school shooting this year, which means there's been a school shooting on average every 60 hours so far this year. Your final comment, and for Dr. Metzl, I'd like you to, if you could write one thing in a study guide that people should have as they watch the media for what to watch out for. As you see, Republicans down the line keep repeating their mantra, mental health, and Democrats, some of them, talk about gun control. But let's start with you, Lindsay Nichols. On average, one shooting at a school every 60 hours since the beginning of the year?
Right. It's absolutely outrageous, but we have to think of it in terms of the larger gun violence problem here. Children are also at risk in concerts, in movie theaters, and often very times at home. We have an epidemic of murder-suicides in this country that are often preceded by domestic violence. And we need to look at that in that larger context and remember that that schools are actually overall relatively safe places for children to be when you talk about the larger impact on children and on all members of our society. We do know that there are just too many families that have lost loved ones, and we need to start looking as a country at that.
And Jonathan Metzl, I add to my questions to you. How should Nicholas Cruz have been dealt with? He's already admitted to this shooting. He's posted online endlessly threats to kill people. But 39 police visits to his home to deal with domestic violence or a mentally ill individual. The school kicking him out because he would bring, among other things, ammunition to school, stalked girls, etc. What went wrong here, and what do you think people need to understand as they watch what happens over the next few days?
Sure. Well, I'll answer both of the questions if you don't mind. The first, in response to the question you just asked, is I think that Lindsay was right at the top of the show here that there's something called a gun violence restraining order. It's basically a lot of times when you see people in the emergency room or police contacts, it's just a quick snapshot. But families, classmates, people like that, I think really know a lot about what's going on. And so there are temporary measures that are very effective in other states. And so certainly I think that needs to become national policy, because certainly a lot of times it's the domestic partners, it's the families who can see somebody escalate at a time like this. So it's not like there's no policy solution, but it's not a mental illness solution. It's a family network, social network solution. In terms of what I think psychiatry and mental health can do, I don't know if this will go into a study guide, but I think the question that rarely gets asked at times like this is, why do we need so many guns in the first place? What kind of society do we really live in and want to live in? I think that these broader questions are ones that I think mental health expertise can be really useful in having conversations, because I think what happens in the aftermath of this is that people just start to mistrust each other. All of a sudden, we need more guns in school, more armed guards, more metal detectors. And so in a way, what happens to society is a question that we rarely ask, because this mistrust becomes so pervasive. And really, that's where I think mental health expertise can be useful, is to ask the broader questions of that.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, Professor of Psychiatry, Director of the Center for Medicine, Health and Society at Vanderbilt University. His recent Politico piece we will link to. I'm a psychiatrist. Making gun violence about mental health is a crazy idea. And thanks so much to Lindsay Nichols, Federal Policy Director, Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at two issues: the postings online of the gunman, his threats when he would post on YouTube, talk about the people he would kill, say he would become a professional school shooter. How was that missed when people even reported this? And we'll talk about his stalking of and harassing women, so often linked, a precursor to mass shootings. Stay with us. Long Shadow by Twin Limb, here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, the FBI confirmed it had received a tip about someone who went by the name Nicholas Cruz online. That's Nicholas spelled with a K, N-I-K-O-L-A-S, an unusual spelling. The FBI was notified by a YouTube user after Cruz left a threatening comment on a video. This is FBI Special Agent Robert Lasky.
In 2017, the FBI received information about a comment made on a YouTube channel. The comment simply said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." No other information was included with that comment, which would indicate a time, location, or the true identity of the person who made the comment. The FBI conducted database reviews, checks, but was unable to further identify the person who actually made the comment.
Meanwhile, more evidence has emerged showing the Florida school gunman, Nicholas Cruz, shared a common trait with many other men who've carried out mass shootings. He had a record of abusing and threatening women. One student told the New York Times Nicholas Cruz was abusive towards his ex-girlfriend, was expelled after getting in a fight with her new boyfriend. Another student told the New York Times he had been close friends with Cruz, but cut him off after he started going after and threatening a female friend of his. And Cruz's former math teacher told the Times he was taken with another student to the point of stalking her. Fellow students also said Cruz was known for holding extreme political views. On Thursday, a white nationalist hate group called the Republic of Florida Militia claimed the gunman was a member who had trained with the militia, but the group's leader later walked back that claim. The former classmates of Cruz did describe him as politically extreme. A 17-year-old junior named Ocean Parody told the Daily Beast Cruz, quote, for example, he would degrade Islamic people as terrorists and bombers. I've seen him wear a Trump hat. Cruz once posted a photograph on Instagram wearing a mask and a red Make America Great Again hat. CNN also aired footage of a shirtless Cruz wearing the same hat, shooting a gun in his backyard that was taken by a next-door neighbor. A 16-year-old junior, Josh Charo, who was in JROTC with Cruz, that's the military training program for high school kids, said Cruz often expressed racist beliefs. Charo told the Daily Beast East, he would always talk about how he felt whites were a bit higher than everyone. He'd be like, my people are over here industrializing the world and starting new things while your people, meaning blacks and Latinos, are just taking up space. In a comment he posted to a YouTube video, Nicholas Cruz also singled out anti-fascist protesters known as Antifa to threaten mass murder. His comment read, I'm going to watch them sheep fall. F Antifa. I wish to kill as many as I can. Well, we're joined right now by two guests. In Philadelphia, George Ciccarello-Maher is with us, visiting scholar at the Hemispheric Institute at New York University, author of Decolonizing Dialectics. And Trevor Aronson is with us from Florida, the executive director and co-founder of the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting nonprofit journalism organization, also a contributing writer to The Intercept. Trevor, let's begin with you. What needs to be understood right now about what took place in Florida?
That we'd be having much more of today if Nicholas Cruz's name was Muhammad would be, what was the FBI's intelligence failure in this? I mean, if you consider the media response and the public outcry following Omar Mateen's shooting in Orlando, the large question was, how did we miss this? How did the FBI miss this? And I think what you're seeing is that the FBI has the mechanisms through processes called threat assessments to conduct wide-ranging investigations for people who may pose a threat to people or public safety. And that in Omar Mateen's case, we saw 2 of those conducted for, the basis being someone had mentioned to the FBI that Omar Mateen knew the Boston Marathon bombers, and that justified an investigation where the FBI interviewed Mateen, looked through his records. By contrast, here in Nicholas Cruz's case, he posted on YouTube making threatening statements. Given the unusual spelling of his first name, given that he used his real name on the social media comments, it's a little bit hard to believe that the FBI did not have an opportunity to dig up some information in records, including gun purchase records, that would have been able to at least give them some reason to continue that investigation. And so I think what we're seeing here is really a question of what did the FBI know and whether they should have pursued this more aggressively. I think what we know from previous investigations that if they believe that Nicholas Cruz was involved in kind of radical ideologies involving Islam, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we would have seen a much more vigorous investigation than what we've seen so far based on what the FBI has come forward with on its investigation of Nicholas Cruz. I
mean, the suspect, Nicholas Cruz, reportedly commented on YouTube, I'm going to be a professional school shooter. Again, with his name, with the spelling of his name. And between 2010 and now, the local police visited him, according to CNN, 39 times, his family, for domestic violence or a mentally ill individual at his house. His neighbors talk about how the police were always coming there. There is a serious disconnect, and yet the FBI said, we can't begin to find something like this.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that, post 9/11, the government created a number of entities or beefed up a number of entities that would have allowed for the greater sharing of information and intelligence from police agencies to federal law enforcement. A big part of that is the creation of joint terrorism task forces around the country. And one of the largest of those in the nation is in South Florida, and that facilitates the sharing of information and intelligence from local police to federal law enforcement. And the way the system is supposed to work, I mean, this system was designed in large part to find the next 9/11 attackers, so to speak, but it's also designed to find people like Nicholas Cruz who, pose a significant threat to public safety. And the way the system is supposed to work is that by identifying threats such as the YouTube comment he made in his own name, not using not using an alias and seemingly not using a VPN to shield his IP address, that type of tip should have been processed through something like a JTTF that may have unearthed the police visits in his home in Broward County. I think it's important to recognize that obviously it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback here and say, here's what the FBI missed. But I also think it's important to point out that this is really the FBI's job, that post 9/11, its primary purpose has been to find threats before they happen. And that doesn't just involve people who are inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It also it involves people who are inspired by other radical ideologies or, frankly, who are, as Donald Trump pointed out, mentally ill. I mean, the goal is no matter what the ideology or the purpose, that if someone poses a significant threat, these information sharing processes are supposed to be able to help the FBI identify the person before they commit their crime.
I want to turn for a moment to a guest we had on recently, shortly after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. That was in June 2016, not so far away from where the Parkland shooting has just happened. Democracy Now! Spoke to Soraya Chemaly, and I asked her about this often overlooked connection between domestic violence and mass shootings.
You see repeatedly in these cases of mass violence, particularly where 4 or more people are killed, that the perpetrator had a history of attacking an intimate partner, a parent. It happened in the Boston Massacre. It happened in Sandy Hook. And so for many of us, you kind of just wait for this information to come to the surface. And we wonder, why is it that this kind of behavior isn't seen as an essential element to understanding lethality in public violence? If you have a person living in your community that is violently abusive towards his family, that is a concern for the broader community. In this case, in Orlando, which is often the case, there seems to be no report made to the police, which means that we're inhibited as a society from taking further action. So he, for example, was completely able to go and legally get guns. We have a federal law that should have prohibited that if, for example, he'd had a restraining order. But more than 50 states actually do not have laws that support that.
So that's journalist Soraya Chemaly. And again, just to reiterate, one student told the New York Times Nikolas Cruz was abusive towards his ex-girlfriend, was expelled after getting a fight with her new boyfriend. Another student told Times he'd been close friends with Cruz, but cut him off after he started going after and threatening a female friend of his. Math teacher said he was bothering another female student to the point of stalking her. George Ciccariello, respond to this.
Whatsoever. The shooter, who is apparently a white supremacist, is also and has also been violent toward women in his life. This is something that we have known. This is not a surprise. These things go hand in hand because white supremacy and patriarchy are violent structures of power that, when frustrated, lead to violent conclusions. And yet, when we say this over and over again in the media, it's treated as if it's the first time anyone has ever heard it. And all of the data and all the information that we have out there has everything to tell us that this is actually accurate. And this is what was said after the Las Vegas shooting, when it came out that the shooter had been in public, violently aggressive toward his own partner, and happens repeatedly in cases like this. And it's really frustrating to have to say over and over again that this correlation exists, that violence toward women, in this case also violence toward animals, this sort of violent outlet of aggression across this person's life has something to do with feelings of dominance that are also expressed in what is apparently white supremacist ideology as well.
Now, this issue of the connection to white supremacy, let me go back to Trevor, then to George. Trevor Aronson, this issue of the link of a person from a Florida white supremacist group saying that Nikolas Cruz trained with them, but now walking it back.
Yeah, so initially we had a number of reports that were first initiated by some research that was done by the Anti-Defamation League that linked Nikolas Cruz to a group based in Tallahassee called the Republic of Florida, which is a white nationalist group that says it's trying to bring about a white-only state of Florida. And what the leader of that group said, Jacob Jared, was that Nikolas Cruz had trained with them and was a member of their group. And in fact, in a subsequent interview with the Daily Beast, Jacob Jared said that they had actually purchased a weapon for him and had trained with him in Tallahassee as well. Later on Gab, which is a Twitter-like social media platform that was set up to provide a home for white supremacists who'd been kicked off Twitter for their odious views, Jacob Jarrett, the leader of the Republic of Florida, walked that back and basically said, oh, you know, we have a number of people named Nicholas, and I got confused. And so it's hard to know if Jacob Jarrett was just using this tragedy as a way of, you know, getting his organization's name out there. And if that's the case, you know, it certainly worked. Or, you know, it's also possible that Nicholas Cruz, you know, did have some white supremacist views. The sourcing on that is a little bit shaky right now, and it's hard to know. I mean, based on some of the comments that he made against Antifa, for example, I mean, certainly there was some political ideology on the right, but at the same time, it's a little bit unclear, I think, whether he was indeed a part of a white supremacist group or identified with a white supremacist ideology. And
of course, you have his friends saying he was Islamophobic. He was saying whites were superior to blacks and Latinos, and then continuing on this issue of the connection between this kind of racism and his misogyny.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to the point I was making earlier about how, you know, the FBI's threat assessment system is designed to establish these kind of warning signs and piece them together and put together a profile of who might be dangerous and then allocate resources accordingly, whether that's dropping by Nicholas Cruz's house to interview him and maybe scaring him straight, or to, you know, build a case to put together a file that might give you reason to suspect that he could be dangerous in the future. But you know, certainly the comments that he made on YouTube, and certainly the kind of racist comments that he had made, or, you know, a threat assessment, for example, could involve the interviewing of students, of friends, and that's the type of process that would unearth the things that the media has since unearthed, which is that Nicholas Cruz seemed to have some right-wing beliefs that may have bordered on violence. And, you know, had the FBI investigated this as you see them investigate cases of possible Islamic extremism, you know, I think it's a fair argument to make that what the FBI would have known about Nicholas Cruz would have been much more significant than what it did when the shootings happened, which was basically that the FBI has admitted to knowing very little, if anything, about Nicholas Cruz at the time of the attack.
The issue of Nicholas Cruz being involved with Jay Rotzi, with Junior Rotzi, George Chicarella Marr, if you could talk about your concerns about this. Also, one of the young women who was killed was also a member of Jay Rotzi.
I think we should be, you know, very attentive to all of these factors. It's difficult to draw out of his involvement in, you know, in what is a, you know, a very widespread military training program. We should, of course, however, be aware that these are military training programs for a U.S. government that's involved in mass violence abroad, and we shouldn't always be surprised to see that violence brought home. I think we should focus very sharply in this case, though, on this question of white supremacist organizing. I know there are a lot of details going back and forth about it. I wouldn't be surprised that the founder of this white nationalist organization is walking it back out of fear of the scrutiny that he's going to receive. As I understand it, it was also confirmed by ABC via several classmates that he had been involved in this group. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that the last year has seen a dramatic uptick in open white supremacist, white nationalist violence. We know that these are violent organizations. We know that they're breeding violence. We've seen it in Charlottesville. We've seen it when Milo supporters have opened fire, on others, and supporters of Richard Spencer, have encouraged violence at protests. And we need to, at the same time, we're told that these are just ideas in the great, marketplace of ideas to be debated and discussed. But we need to realize is that you don't discuss white supremacy, you don't debate it, you destroy it, you out-organize it. And that's something that we need to be doing on a much broader level while we're trying to grapple with what's gone on in this instance. Because we see people being radicalized. Of course, if they were, Muslim, they would be, the question of where were they radicalized has become a bit of a meme. And yet we don't ask this question when it comes to these radicalized white youth who are involved in this mass violence, who are in discussion groups. This is the second, if this is true about his white supremacist ties, this is the second alt-right school shooting in 2 months, the last one in New Mexico by someone who was actively involved in the Daily Stormer, one of the most violent right-wing anti-Semitic websites, on the far right. And this association is direct, and yet we had Trump eliminating almost all oversight of, scrutiny toward white supremacist groups. Even Obama had been cutting that funding, and so we know that the government has no interest in prosecuting and undermining white supremacist organizations, and that organizations on the ground are going to need to do that themselves.
Well, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you both for being with us. Trevor Anderson for joining us from St. Petersburg with the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting and The Intercept. George Ciccarello-Marr, visiting scholar at the Hemispheric Institute at New York University, speaking to us from Philadelphia. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Johannesburg, South Africa. There's a new president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. What happened to Jacob Zuma? Stay with us.
Give us something to the world, and not just to take it from it. And will you ring the bells when you come back? Will you beat the drums when you come back? Will you ring the bells when you come back? Will you beat the drums when you come back? Will you ring the bells when you come back? Will you beat the drums when you come back? By the people's culture, and I'll be the one who climbs up the mountain, reaching for the top of our Africa days, while the poor woman waking for the lazy goat. Say, Africa, say, Africa, say, sing, sing, Africa, sing, sing, Africa. Let the solution of memory of some of the people's lives and say, Africa, say. By the people's culture, and I'll be the one who climbs up the mountain, reaching for the top of...
When You Come Back by Vusi Mashlasela. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show in South Africa. African National Congress leader Cyril Ramaphosa has been confirmed as the new president of South Africa, sworn in after the former leader, President Jacob Zuma, resigned this week from office abruptly amidst a series of corruption scandals. For more, we go to Johannesburg, South Africa, to speak with Koketso Moeti, founder of Amandla.mobi, a community advocacy organization. Her recent piece for News 24 headlined, "The Rich Can't Steal," right? Can you talk about what has happened today, actually what has happened this week, Koketso, and welcome to Democracy Now! Zuma stepping down and Cyril Ramaphosa becoming president.
Yes, thank you. So President Jacob Zuma stepped down after a lot of pressure coming from within the party and the country at large. So there was a bit of extensive negotiations between the newly elected leadership of the African National Congress, after which he was expected to step down. He seemed, in the early days, he seemed to be a bit defiant, but the following day he stepped down when it was known that the motion of no confidence, which was filed by an opposition party, would be passing through Parliament.
The new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, once led the National Union of Mine Workers and during apartheid in the 80s, a famous anti-apartheid leader. He would later build a business empire that included mining interests, including the Marikana Platinum Mine, where police killed 34 workers during a strike in 2012. Now Ramaphosa is one of Africa's wealthiest men with a network of nearly, $500 million. Can you talk about who he is?
So Cyril Ramaphosa, part of the anti-apartheid movement, strong leader within the ANC, long tradition of trade unionism. He stepped down from formal politics in the early 90s, and since then he's been involved in the corporate sector. During his time there within the corporate sector, there's been a bit of a series of scandals that have happened, and it's an interesting pattern of behavior. So what we have is, in 2012, he was on the Lonmin Board of Directors. And during this time, there was an explosive report that was released by the Alternative Information and Development Center that found that Lonmin could have, in fact, afforded a living wage for the mine workers who were brutally gunned down if they had not been shifting profits. So there was a strong allegation of profit shifting. And then an investigative journalism organization called Amabongani did an investigation in 2015 where they found that During the years that Cyril Ramaphosa was the chairperson of the MTN board, MTN had been shifting billions in profit from the continent to outside. And then we saw much more recently in the Paradise Papers leak that Shanduka, a company which Cyril Ramaphosa founded in 2001.
Koketso, we just have 10 seconds.
As shifting profits from the country. So there is a pattern of behavior.
So are you concerned about what this means for South Africa in our last 5 seconds?
Completely. I think we should be deeply concerned, and we should be just as vigilant as we were in the times that we had President Jacob Zuma, if not more so. The moment that we in after Zuma has stepped down should not see civic movement.
Koketso Moeti, I want to thank you for being with us, founder of Amandla Mobi. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.